Bradley Covington slapped the divorce papers onto the kitchen counter like he was closing a business deal, not ending a 20-year marriage. He didn't even look at her. "You'll take the offer, Sarah. $800,000 the house and $5,000 a month. That's more than generous for someone who's done nothing but fold laundry for 2 decades. Sarah stared at the papers. Her hands didn't shake. Her voice didn't break. She simply said, "I'll see you in court, Bradley." He laughed. He actually laughed. He had no idea what was coming. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button and follow this story all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. The morning Bradley Covington decided to blow up his marriage, he woke up at 5:45, same as always, slid out of bed without disturbing Sarah, and stood in front of the bathroom mirror for a long time. Not because he felt guilty, not because he was second-guessing himself. He stood there because he was rehearsing, practicing the exact tone of voice he would use. Calm, controlled, businesslike. The same voice he used when he was about to terminate an employee who thought they were indispensable. Bradley had been planning this for 14 months. 14 months of quiet preparation, of moving accounts, of restructuring holdings, of having very careful, very private conversations with his attorney Theodore Maxwell, who charged $420 an hour and who had handled more high-asset divorces in Cook County than any other lawyer in Chicago. Bradley wasn't walking into this blind. He was walking in armed. He was also walking in with Camilla Rhodes waiting on the other side. Camilla was 31 years old, his vice president of strategic development, and she had a way of looking at Bradley like he had personally invented ambition. She was sharp-hungry, beautiful in the particular way that powerful men found intoxicating, not soft, not quiet, but electric. She wanted things, big things, and she had made it very clear that she wanted them with Bradley. Bradley had told himself for months that his marriage to Sarah had simply run its course, that they had grown apart. That it wasn't cruel to leave, it was honest. It was practical. It was in his mind, even kind, giving Sarah a clean exit, a comfortable settlement, a chance to find whatever quiet life she was suited for. But if Bradley was being truly honest, which he rarely was, even with himself, the real reason he felt so confident about this divorce was simpler than any of that. He thought Sarah had nothing. Sarah Covington was making coffee when Bradley came downstairs that morning. She was wearing the gray cardigan she'd had for 6 years, the one with the small hole near the left cuff that she had never bothered to mend. Her hair was pulled back. She had reading glasses pushed up on her head, even though she wasn't reading anything. She looked, as she almost always looked, completely ordinary. She handed him a mug without him asking for it. That was the thing about Sarah. She anticipated things. She had always anticipated things. Bradley had stopped noticing years ago. "We need to talk," he said. She turned back to the counter and poured her own coffee. "I know." That stopped him. "You know, sit down, Bradley." He didn't sit. He preferred to have this conversation standing. It felt more authoritative. He set his coffee down and crossed his arms. "I've had papers drawn up. My attorney, Theodore Maxwell," she said. $420 an hour. "Yes." He stared at her. "How do you know what he charges?" "I know a lot of things." She turned and looked at him, then really looked at him, and there was something in her expression that he couldn't quite read. It wasn't anger, it wasn't devastation, it was closer to the expression you might wear when you already know the ending of a movie, but you've agreed to sit through it anyway. "Go ahead, tell me what you have planned." He laid it out. $800,000. The Oak Park house. $5,000 a month in alimony for 5 years, after which it would be reviewed. He would retain full ownership and control of Covington Data Dynamics. Sarah would sign a non-disclosure agreement regarding company operations, a standard clause Maxwell had assured him. He framed it as generosity. He used phrases like "more than fair" and "starting over," and "this is the right thing for both of us." Sarah listened to all of it. She didn't interrupt once. When he finished, she picked up her coffee mug, took a long sip, and said, "No." "Sarah, no," she said again, and her voice was so quiet and so steady that it was somehow louder than if she had screamed it. "I'll see you in court, Bradley." He laughed. He genuinely laughed because the idea of Sarah, his Sarah housewife, Sarah, gray cardigan Sarah, fighting him in court was so absurd that his body's only response was laughter. He had a forensic accountant. He had Maxwell. He had 14 months of careful preparation. What did Sarah have? She watched him laugh. She didn't react. She just picked up her reading glasses from the top of her head, put them on, and turned back to whatever she was reading on the counter, as if the conversation was already over. Bradley left for work, still chuckling. He had absolutely no idea. The boys found out 3 days later. Marcus was 17 and Eli was 15, and they were in the way of teenage sons, simultaneously perceptive about everything and willfully oblivious to the specifics. They had noticed the cold silences, the separate schedules, the way their father sometimes looked at his phone and smiled in a way that had nothing to do with anything in that house. But knowing something is wrong and having it confirmed to your face are two entirely different experiences, Bradley told them on a Thursday evening. He sat them down in the living room, used his calm, controlled, businesslike voice, and explained that he and their mother had grown apart, that this was a mutual decision, that nothing would change about their relationship with him, that he would always be their father. Marcus looked at his mother the entire time their father was talking. Sarah sat with her hands folded in her lap, her expression composed, and she did not cry. Later, Marcus would tell his best friend that the thing that scared him most about that night was not his father's words, but his mother's stillness, like she was the only person in the room who wasn't surprised. Eli cried. He was 15, and he was still at the age where crying felt like the appropriate response to pain, rather than something to be suppressed, and he cried with the kind of honest grief that most adults have forgotten how to access. Sarah held him. Bradley reached over and patted his son's shoulder with the deliberate care of a man executing a gesture he had decided in advance would be appropriate. After Bradley left the room to take a phone call, Marcus leaned close to his mother and said in a low voice, "Mom, are you okay? Like actually okay?" Sarah kissed the top of his head. "I need you to trust me," she said quietly. "I do trust you." "Good. Then I need you to not worry about what happens next." Marcus pulled back and looked at her face. He was 17 and smart, and he had his mother's eyes dark and still and very, very observant. "You've got something, don't you?" Sarah almost smiled. "Almost. Go check on your brother." Theodore Maxwell filed the initial petition on the 14th of the following month, and from the moment the documents hit the Cook County Circuit Court system, the case began drawing quiet but significant attention. Not publicly, not yet, but within the legal community, word travels fast about cases that involve significant assets, and Bradley Covington's divorce was shaping up to be exactly that kind of case. Maxwell had filed a financial disclosure that painted a very specific picture of Bradley Covington's worth, Covington Data Dynamics. He declared was valued at $22 million, though naturally given the volatility of the tech sector, current market conditions had introduced certain uncertainties, a caveat Maxwell had carefully constructed to create wiggle room. There were investment accounts, a pension vehicle, a vacation property in Wisconsin that had appreciated nicely, a collectibles portfolio that Maxwell had somehow managed to classify as personal property rather than marital assets. It was a masterpiece of selective accounting. What the disclosure did not mention was the name Vanguard Horizon Ventures. What it did not mention was a particular inflection point in Covington Data Dynamics history 8 years earlier when the company had been 43 days from insolvency. When the servers had been underpowered, the main contract they'd been counting on had evaporated. The line of credit had maxed out, and Bradley Covington had been spending his evenings in the basement office he'd started the company in, staring at spreadsheets that told him the same thing no matter how many times he refreshed them. He had not told Maxwell about that. He had not told anyone. As far as the legal record was concerned, Covington Data Dynamics had been a Bradley Covington success story start to finish uninterrupted. On the other side of the case, a woman named Evelyn Porter had been retained as Sarah Covington's attorney. Maxwell had looked up Porter's record when her name appeared on the opposing counsel notification, and he had found it unremarkable. Respectable, certainly. Competent. But nothing that suggested she would be a serious obstacle to the strategy he had spent a year building. Porter was known for family law mid-range asset cases, the kind of careful, steady legal work that rarely made headlines. What Maxwell did not know, what almost no one knew, was that Evelyn Porter had spent 3 months before filing a single document, working alongside a forensic accounting team that had quietly but methodically mapped every financial thread connected to the Covington marriage. Every thread, including the ones that led to places Bradley Covington had believed were permanently sealed. Porter had said almost nothing in their preliminary hearing. She had asked for standard discovery, standard timelines, nothing aggressive, nothing that would signal her hand. She had been, by all appearances, a competent but unexceptional opponent. Maxwell had told Bradley after that hearing, "This is going to be straightforward." Bradley had nodded with the calm of a man who believed he had already won. The first court date arrived on a sharp Tuesday morning in November, the kind of Chicago November that attacks you the moment you step outside bitter wind off the lake. Gray sky pressing down close, the city's particular brand of cold that isn't just temperature, but attitude. Bradley arrived with Maxwell and 2 associates. He wore a charcoal suit that had been cut specifically for his frame, a midnight blue tie that projected both authority and approachability, Maxwell's recommendation, and the expression of a man attending a meeting he expected to conclude before lunch. He saw Sarah in the corridor outside courtroom 14. She was standing with Porter and a woman he didn't recognize, a woman who was carrying a document case that was considerably thicker than anything Maxwell's team was holding. Sarah was wearing a dark navy dress, simple, elegant, nothing ostentatious, and she had her hair down for once, and she was listening carefully to something Porter was saying, nodding occasionally, her reading glasses in her hand. Bradley watched her for a moment. Something shifted very slightly in his chest. Not guilt, not second-guessing. Something else, something he couldn't name. He turned away from it and followed Maxwell into the courtroom. Judge Margaret Albright was already on the bench when they entered. She was in her late 50s with close-cropped silver hair and the particular quality of stillness that comes from decades of presiding over rooms full of conflict. She had seen everything. You could tell that just from looking at her. She had the demeanor of someone who did not have time for theater, but was prepared to sit through as much of it as necessary. Maxwell opened confidently. He outlined Bradley's singular vision, his relentless work ethic, his personal sacrifice and risk-taking in building Covington Data Dynamics from a literal basement startup into a $22 million enterprise. He spoke about Sarah's role in the marriage with the careful condescension of a man who believed he was being generous, acknowledging her contributions as a homemaker, recognizing the value of her domestic management, while making it unambiguously clear that none of that had any connection to the company's success. "Mr. Covington," Maxwell said at one point during Bradley's testimony, "would you describe your wife's involvement in Covington Data Dynamics at any point during the company's development?" Bradley sat up slightly in the witness box. He had rehearsed this. "Sarah was never involved in the business. She preferred to focus on the home and the boys, which I fully supported. The company was my project, my risk, my achievement. Your achievement alone. From day one." He said it cleanly, firmly, with the conviction of a man who had told himself this story so many times it had become in his mind indistinguishable from fact. From the gallery, Marcus Covington, sitting beside his younger brother, heard those words and felt something cold move through him. He glanced at his mother. Sarah was writing something on a notepad and did not look up. Porter's cross-examination of Bradley was brief that first day, almost suspiciously brief. She asked him to confirm the founding date of Covington Data Dynamics. He confirmed it. She asked him to confirm that the company had been entirely self-funded in its early years, relying solely on Bradley's personal capital and a small business loan. He confirmed it. She asked him to confirm that he had no knowledge of any external investors with equity stakes in the company at any point in its history. Bradley said, "Correct." Porter looked at him for a long moment, not challenging, not theatrical. She just looked at him with the quiet attention of someone cataloging information for later use. "No further questions," she said, and sat down. Maxwell leaned slightly toward Bradley and murmured, barely audible, "Good, very good." Bradley exhaled slowly. He was fine. This was fine. He had this. But across the courtroom at the plaintiff's table, Evelyn Porter opened the thick document case that her associate had been carrying, and she began laying out files in a very specific order, methodical and unhurried, like someone setting a table for a dinner that was just about to begin. Bradley noticed her doing it. He told himself it meant nothing. He told himself that for the rest of that afternoon, and through dinner with Maxwell at a restaurant on Michigan Avenue, where Maxwell drank scotch and talked about how well things were going, and through the evening in his apartment, where Camilla sat close to him on the couch and told him it was almost over almost, and through the sleepless hours after midnight, when he lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling. He told himself it meant nothing. But somewhere deep in the part of Bradley Covington that was not the CEO or the strategist or the man who had prepared for 14 months somewhere, in the part of him that was just a human being, lying awake in the dark, something was beginning very quietly to understand that he had made a mistake. He just didn't know yet what kind of mistake it was. He didn't know yet that the woman he had handed divorce papers to with barely a glance, the woman in the gray cardigan with the unrepaired cuff, had 8 years ago, when he was 43 days from losing everything he had ever built, done something extraordinary. He didn't know yet that she had saved him. He didn't know yet that she had saved him quietly, anonymously, strategically, and completely, and that she had spent the years since building something of her own, patiently and invisibly, the way she did everything right there in plain sight. He would know soon. Court resumed Thursday morning, and Thursday morning Evelyn Porter would stand up and begin to speak, and everything Bradley Covington thought he knew about his marriage, his company, and the woman he had so casually decided to discard all of it was about to collapse one document at a time in front of Judge Margaret Albright in courtroom 14 on a bitter Chicago morning in November. The table was set. The dinner was about to begin. Thursday morning came the way all consequential mornings do, quietly without ceremony, indifferent to the fact that lives were about to change inside it. Bradley arrived at courtroom 14 7 minutes early. Maxwell was already there arranging documents with the practiced efficiency of a man who had done this hundreds of times. Bradley sat down, straightened his tie, and looked across the aisle at the plaintiff's table. Sarah was already seated. She hadn't looked at him when he walked in. She was reading something, her glasses on her posture relaxed in the way of someone who had slept well and eaten breakfast and felt entirely prepared for what the day held. Porter sat beside her, speaking quietly into her ear. Sarah nodded once. Then she turned a page. Bradley studied her for a moment. Then he looked away and told himself the same thing he'd been telling himself since Tuesday. He had this. Maxwell had this. The numbers were on his side. The structure was airtight. And whatever Porter was planning to present today would amount to nothing more than the standard tactical maneuvering that came with every contested divorce. He believed that right up until the moment Evelyn Porter stood up. She didn't begin with drama. That was the thing that would stay with everyone in that courtroom for a long time afterward, the absolute absence of theater in the way she opened. She stood, she buttoned her jacket, and she said in a voice that was conversational and precise, "Your Honor, I'd like to introduce into evidence a series of documents relating to the financial history of Covington Data Dynamics, specifically regarding a critical juncture in the company's development that occurred approximately 8 years ago." Maxwell was on his feet immediately. Objection. Relevance. The financial history of the company has already been established through Mr. Covington's disclosure. Judge Albright looked at Porter. Counselor. Your Honor, the relevance will be established within the first 10 minutes of my presentation. What I'm about to show this court directly contradicts the financial narrative that has been presented by opposing counsel and will fundamentally alter the asset valuation in this case. Albright studied her for a moment. I'll allow it. Mr. Maxwell, you'll have opportunity to respond. Let's proceed. Maxwell sat down slowly. He kept his face neutral, but Bradley caught something flicker across it. Not worry, not quite, but awareness. The awareness of a man who had just realized that the terrain might be slightly different from what he'd mapped. Bradley leaned toward him. What is she doing? Maxwell said quietly. Let her talk. She's fishing. Bradley nodded. He watched Porter walk toward the center of the courtroom, holding a single document, and he watched her hand it to the court clerk, and he watched the clerk pass it to Judge Albright, and he watched the judge put on her reading glasses and look at it. And he watched Judge Albright's expression change. It was subtle, barely perceptible. But Bradley had spent 20 years reading rooms, reading faces, reading the micro-expressions of people sitting across conference tables from him. He saw it, a slight shift in the set of the judge's mouth, a slowing of her eyes as they moved across the page. That was the first moment Bradley felt it, the actual physical sensation of the floor moving under him. Not metaphorically, a real bodily sensation, like the moment before a fall, when you know you're going down and there is absolutely nothing you can do about it. He pressed his hands flat against the table. Porter turned to face the courtroom and said, 8 years ago, Covington Data Dynamics was 43 days from bankruptcy. The silence that followed was total. Bradley did not move. His face did not change. Years of boardrooms had given him that much the ability to keep his expression locked, even when everything inside him was in free fall. Maxwell put his pen down. Porter continued, at that time the company had exhausted its line of credit, lost its primary contract, and was facing imminent collapse. Mr. Covington had no viable path to additional financing. No bank would extend further credit. No known investor had been approached successfully. She paused, and yet 6 weeks later Covington Data Dynamics received a capital infusion of $1.4 million from an entity called Vanguard Horizon Ventures. The company was saved. It went on to become the $22 million enterprise that Mr. Covington testified under oath he built entirely through his own efforts and resources. She let that sentence sit in the air of the courtroom like smoke. Your Honor, Porter said, turning back to the judge, I would like to enter into evidence the full corporate registration documents for Vanguard Horizon Ventures, forensically verified, along with the accompanying ownership records. The document made its way to the bench. Albright looked at it. She looked at it for a long time, long enough that the silence in the courtroom became something you could feel against your skin. Then she looked up directly at Bradley Covington, and she said nothing. She didn't need to say anything. The look said everything. Maxwell was whispering urgently in Bradley's ear. Bradley heard the words, but they weren't connecting. His entire attention was tunneled down to one single point, one question that was expanding inside his chest like a physical thing. How did she find it? He had been so careful. The Vanguard documents had been filed under a shell structure, a layered corporate arrangement that his own attorney at the time had told him was essentially untraceable. He had never discussed it. He had never acknowledged it in any financial disclosure. As far as he had been concerned, that particular piece of history was buried so deep it would never surface. He had never, not once in 8 years, considered that the reason it might be untraceable was not because the structure was impenetrable, but because no one had ever thought to look. No one except Evelyn Porter and the forensic accounting team that Sarah had quietly retained 7 months before Bradley even told her he wanted a divorce. Porter said, the sole registered principal of Vanguard Horizon Ventures is identified in these documents as S.M. Chen. She paused. S.M. Chen is the maiden name of Sarah Margaret Covington, and the courtroom went absolutely electric. Not loud, not chaotic, but there was a collective intake of breath, a shift in the air pressure of the room, the unmistakable physical manifestation of an assembled group of people processing something that has just rewritten what they thought they knew. Two of Maxwell's associates looked at each other. The court reporter's fingers stopped moving for just a moment before resuming. A journalist in the gallery who had slipped in that morning on a routine court beat and was now sitting up very straight, pressed his pen hard against his notepad. Bradley turned and looked at Sarah. Sarah was writing on her notepad. She did not look up. She turned a page. Counselor? Judge Albright said, her voice perfectly controlled. Please continue. Porter continued. For the next 22 minutes, she presented the case with the methodical precision of someone who had spent months building a structure specifically designed to be irrefutable. The forensic accounting team had traced every thread, the capital infusion from Vanguard Horizon Ventures, The equity stake that had been buried in a contractual clause that Bradley himself had signed, a clause that had been drafted to look like a standard investor buyout provision, but which, under Illinois corporate law, had never been properly executed. The buyout had never happened. The equity had never been formally transferred, which meant that Sarah Covington, as the principal of Vanguard Horizon Ventures, had held an undisclosed but legally valid equity stake in Covington Data Dynamics for 8 years. Maxwell objected 7 times during Porter's presentation. Albright sustained 2 of them, overruled 5. When Porter finished, she returned to her table, sat down beside Sarah, and in a voice pitched low enough for only Sarah to hear, said, "First phase complete." Sarah nodded once, still writing on her notepad. Maxwell immediately requested a recess. Albright gave him 15 minutes. In a corridor outside the courtroom, Maxwell turned on Bradley with the controlled fury of a man who is too professional to raise his voice, but whose entire body is communicating something very close to that. "Tell me about Vanguard Horizon Ventures, right now, everything." Bradley ran a hand over his face. The hallway was cold and bright, and he suddenly felt very exposed in his precisely cut charcoal suit. "It was 8 years ago. The company was in trouble, real trouble. I needed capital, and there was an offer." "From your wife?" "I didn't know it was Sarah. I didn't know. The entity was completely anonymous. There was a law firm intermediary. He stopped. He heard himself talking and heard exactly how it sounded, and he stopped. Maxwell stared at him. "Bradley, are you telling me that you accepted a $1.4 million investment into your company, an investment that saved your company, and you did not know it came from your own wife?" "I didn't know." "And where did Sarah get $1.4 million? A long pause. "Her inheritance, her mother's estate, and she told me she'd made some investments before we married, some cryptocurrency position. I didn't really pay much attention to the details." Maxwell closed his eyes for exactly 3 seconds. When he opened them, his expression had changed in a way that Bradley had never seen before on his attorney's face. It was not anger anymore. It was something that looked almost like resignation. "Bradley," Maxwell said carefully, "what else don't I know?" That question hung between them in the cold corridor, and Bradley Covington, for the first time in 14 months of meticulous preparation, had no confident answer to give. When they returned to the courtroom, Porter was ready with the second phase of her presentation. She had let the first revelation breathe, let it settle into the record, and now she proceeded with the same unhurried precision to the matter of Sarah Covington's personal financial profile. "Your Honor," Porter said, "opposing counsel has represented to this court that my client's financial contribution to the marital estate is limited to her role as homemaker and primary caregiver. I would like to offer into evidence a complete and forensically verified accounting of Sarah Covington's independent financial holdings." She introduced the documents one by one. Not all at once, not as a dramatic reveal, but methodically, piece by piece, each one entering the record cleanly before the next arrived. The inheritance from Sarah's mother, which had been significantly larger than Bradley, had understood. The cryptocurrency positions that Sarah had taken in the very early years of that market, positions that she had held patiently without fanfare, and which had appreciated into figures that made the numbers on Bradley's carefully curated disclosure look modest. The continued investment activity conducted under S.M. Chen, an identity Sarah had maintained since before her marriage through a series of financial accounts that had never been commingled with marital funds, and which therefore under Illinois law remained her separate property. Account after account, position after position, verified, documented, forensically clean. The number, when Porter finally stated it, plainly landed in the courtroom, the way a stone lands in still water, the initial impact, and then the rings moving outward, touching everything. $85 million. Sarah Covington's independently held, legally documented net worth was $85 million. Bradley heard the number, and something happened to his breathing. It wasn't dramatic. He didn't gasp, didn't make a sound, didn't give the room the satisfaction of a visible reaction. But the air left his lungs on a slow, involuntary exhale, and getting it back required a conscious effort that he had to make quietly with his hands flat against the table and his eyes forward. Maxwell said nothing beside him. In the gallery, the journalist had stopped trying to be subtle about how fast he was writing. Marcus Covington was sitting in the second row of the gallery, and when he heard that number, he felt something happen in his face that he couldn't control. Not shock, because he had known something was coming. His mother had told him to trust her, but the scale of it. The actual scale. He turned and looked at Eli, who was sitting beside him, with his mouth slightly open, and Marcus thought Mom, and the thought was not a question, it was something closer to awe. Bradley's eyes moved against his will to the back of Sarah's head, the neat dark hair, the simple navy dress. 20 years he had lived beside this woman. 20 years she had made his coffee and managed his home and raised his sons and attended his company dinners and smiled the appropriate amount and said the appropriate things. 20 years. He had no idea who she was. The thought arrived with the force of a physical blow, and Bradley Covington, who prided himself above all things on his ability to read situations, on his intelligence, on never being the least informed person in any room, sat in that courtroom and understood with complete and devastating clarity that for 20 years he had been exactly that. The least informed person in his own home, in his own marriage, in his own company's story. He had looked at Sarah and seen a housewife. He had looked at Sarah and seen someone manageable, someone whose life was defined by his, whose value was contingent on his, whose future was entirely in his hands. He had looked at her and seen gray cardigans and folded laundry and school pickups, and he had been so satisfied with that image, so comfortable inside it, that it had never once occurred to him to look any further. She had let him. That was the part that was hitting him hardest now. She had let him have that image. For years. She had let him look right at her and see exactly what he expected to see, and she had built an entire world behind that image, quietly, patiently, brilliantly, and she had done it while making his coffee and attending to his sons and smiling at his company dinners. He thought about the moment she had said, "I know," when he'd told her they needed to talk. He thought about the way she had said, "I'll see you in court," and he had laughed. He had actually laughed. He thought about all the files that Porter's associate had been carrying into every hearing, the thick document case, the organized tabs, and he understood now that Sarah had not simply reacted to his divorce filing. She had been prepared, fully, thoroughly, strategically prepared, possibly, before he had even told her he wanted out. Maxwell leaned close to him and said very quietly, "Bradley, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Our strategy needs to be significantly reconsidered." How significantly? The pause. Entirely. Porter was still talking, moving now to the question of the equity stake, the undisclosed, unexecuted buyout clause, the legal status of Sarah's holding in Covington Data Dynamics. She was laying it out with the patience of someone who knows they don't need to rush because the facts are doing all the work on their own. Under the terms of the original investment agreement, and given the failure to properly execute the buyout provision, Sarah held a legitimate claim to an equity position in the company. Maxwell was furiously drafting something on his legal pad. Bradley watched Porter speak and thought about Camilla for the first time in hours. He had texted her that morning before court, just a quick message going well, almost done, and she had responded with a string of encouraging words that now felt like they had arrived from a different universe, a universe where he was still winning. He thought about her the way you think about something that has already become past tense. Porter concluded her second phase presentation and returned to her seat. Judge Albright removed her reading glasses and set them on the bench in front of her, and she looked out at the courtroom for a long moment. Then she said, "Mr. Maxwell, I trust you have a great deal to say in response." Maxwell stood. He was the good attorney, genuinely good, which meant that he was capable of adapting in real time to conditions he hadn't anticipated, and the response he delivered over the next 40 minutes was a legitimate and competent attempt to challenge Porter's evidence on procedural grounds, to argue questions of admissibility and timing and legal interpretation. He was doing his job, he was doing it well. But the room had already shifted. You could feel it. The intangible but unmistakable recalibration that happens in a courtroom when the narrative has fundamentally changed, when the story that everyone walked in believing has been replaced by a different story, and the new story is better documented, more thoroughly evidenced, and more compelling than the one it replaced. Judge Albright listened to Maxwell's response with the same composed attention she brought to everything. She asked questions, careful penetrating questions that Maxwell answered as well as he could. But her eyes several times during his argument moved to Sarah Covington, not with hostility, not with theater, with the quiet, considered attention of a woman who had spent decades on a bench listening to the stories people told about their marriages and who had perhaps rarely heard a story quite like this one. Sarah sat through all of it with her hands folded on the table in front of her, her notepad closed now, her reading glasses resting on top of it. She did not look at Bradley. She did not look at Maxwell. She looked at Judge Albright calmly and directly, the way someone looks at a person they trust, to do the right thing. When Albright called the recess at 12:45, the journalist in the gallery was already walking fast toward the corridor phone to his ear. In the corridor, Maxwell pulled Bradley into an alcove and spoke to him in a voice stripped of everything professional, every courtroom cadence, every carefully calibrated tone. He spoke to him plainly the way you speak to someone when the situation requires it. Bradley, I'm going to tell you something that you need to hear clearly. The equity claim is real, the documentation is solid, and it has been forensically verified. If Porter pursues this to a full ruling, which she will, and if the judge finds, as I think she will find, based on what we've seen today, Sarah's legitimate stake in Covington Data Dynamics could be adjudicated at well above 50%. Add the offshore accounts that their forensic team has flagged for mismanagement, add the concealment penalties under Illinois disclosure law, and we are looking at a scenario where you could leave this marriage as a minority shareholder in your own company. Bradley stared at him. That's not possible. It is possible. It is in fact exactly what is being constructed, document by document in that courtroom right now. Maxwell looked at him steadily. I need to know if there is anything else, anything at all, any other financial arrangement, any other connection to Sarah that I don't currently know about because I cannot fight what I cannot see. A long silence stretched between them in the cold, bright corridor. Bradley said, "There's nothing else." Maxwell nodded slowly in the way of someone who is accepting an answer while reserving judgment about whether he believes it. He straightened his jacket. He looked toward the courtroom doors. Then we go back in there and we fight what we have. Bradley followed him back toward the courtroom doors. As they reached them, Bradley glanced down the corridor and saw Sarah coming out of a side room with Porter, the two of them walking together, talking quietly. Sarah was nodding at something Porter was saying, and she had one hand resting lightly on Porter's arm in a gesture that wasn't grateful or deferential, but something else collegial, almost the gesture of one professional acknowledging another. She looked up and saw Bradley looking at her. For a moment, just a moment, they held eye contact across the length of that corridor. Sarah's expression did not change. She held his gaze for exactly long enough to communicate something that required no words at all, and then she looked back at Porter and continued the conversation, and pushed through the courtroom door without a backward glance. Bradley stood there for a moment longer. Then he followed. The afternoon session was about to begin, and Evelyn Porter was not finished. Not even close. The afternoon session began at 1:53. Maxwell had used every minute of the lunch recess. Bradley could tell by the way his attorney moved when he returned to the table with the slightly overcorrected confidence of a man who had spent an hour regrouping and was now performing certainty rather than feeling it. Two of Maxwell's associates had clearly been on phones the entire break. One of them was still typing something when Albright entered and everyone stood. Bradley sat down and looked straight ahead. He had not eaten lunch. Maxwell had ordered sandwiches that sat untouched on the conference room table while they strategized. Bradley had drunk 2 cups of bad coffee and spent 40 minutes listening to Maxwell reframe the situation in the most favorable terms available. And what he had understood from that exercise was this: the most favorable terms available were not very favorable at all. The equity claim was the core problem. Everything else, the financial disclosures, the asset valuations, the alimony calculations, all of it was secondary to the question of whether Sarah's original investment through Vanguard Horizon Ventures constituted a legally valid ongoing equity stake in Covington Data Dynamics. If it did, and if the buyout provision had indeed never been properly executed, then the entire financial architecture that Maxwell had spent a year constructing was built on a foundation that had just been revealed as sand. Maxwell had spent lunch trying to find a crack in Porter's documentation. He had not found one. What he had found and what he had told Bradley with the careful delivery of someone conveying a terminal diagnosis was that the forensic accounting team Porter had employed appeared to have been working on this case for a minimum of 6 months, possibly longer. The documentation was not reactive. It was not the work of a team that had responded to a divorce filing and scrambled to build a case. It was prepared, layered, anticipatory. It addressed legal counter-arguments that Maxwell had not even made yet, which meant Sarah had known, before he told her, before the kitchen counter, before the divorce papers, before the conversation where he had practiced his calm, controlled, businesslike voice in the bathroom mirror. She had already known, and she had already been building. Bradley turned this over in his mind as he sat at the defense table waiting for Albright to call the afternoon session to order. He turned it over the way you turn over something sharp, carefully aware that every angle of it has an edge. 14 months he had prepared. She had prepared longer. Albright settled, looked out at the courtroom and said, "Ms. Porter, you indicated this morning that you had additional evidence to present this afternoon. Please proceed." Porter stood. "Thank you, Your Honor. This afternoon, I'd like to address the matter of Mr. Covington's financial disclosures as submitted to this court, specifically as they relate to certain offshore account structures, and the question of whether those accounts represent marital assets subject to equitable distribution." Maxwell was on his feet. "Your Honor, the offshore accounts in question have been characterized in Mr. Covington's disclosure as premarital personal assets and are not subject to equitable distribution under Illinois law." "Ms. Porter," Albright said. "Your Honor, we intend to demonstrate that the characterization of those accounts as premarital is inaccurate, that marital funds were used to establish and maintain those structures, and that Mr. Covington's non-disclosure of their full value represents a deliberate and material misrepresentation to this court." The word deliberate landed with specific weight. Deliberate misrepresentation in a financial disclosure to a court was not a procedural technicality. It was the kind of language that had consequences well beyond a divorce settlement. Albright's expression did not change, but she set her pen down. "That is a serious allegation, Counselor." "Yes, Your Honor. We do not make it lightly. The documentation supports it fully." She gestured for Porter to proceed. What came next was 28 minutes of methodical, precise, and utterly devastating forensic accounting testimony delivered through a financial expert witness named Dr. Caroline Weiss, who had a CV that ran to 4 pages, and the particular quality of a person who has spent so much time inside financial data that complexity has become the native language of her thinking. She spoke clearly, accessibly, without condescension, translating the architecture of Bradley's offshore structures into terms that anyone in the courtroom could follow. The accounts had been established 11 years ago, she explained. The seed capital had come from a bonus paid through Covington Data Dynamics, a company that, as of 8 years ago, had Sarah Covington as a legitimate equity holder. Marital funds had been used in the maintenance of those structures on at least 4 documented occasions. The accounts had appreciated significantly, a fact that had been concealed in Bradley's disclosure through a combination of undervaluation and strategic omission. Dr. Weiss presented the actual current value of the offshore accounts. The number was $4.2 million, above what Bradley's disclosure had declared. Maxwell objected 3 times during Dr. Weiss's testimony. Albright overruled all 3. Bradley sat at the table and felt a specific, focused kind of fear that he had not experienced since he was 26 years old, and the first business he had ever built had collapsed and taken everything he had invested with it. He had been broke, then genuinely broke, and he had rebuilt from nothing, and he had spent every year since building walls around what he'd created. Financial walls, legal walls, strategic walls, because that specific fear of losing everything was the one thing he could not tolerate. And now he was watching those walls come down. Not violently. That was almost the hardest part. Porter wasn't tearing anything down. She was simply showing the court document by document that what Bradley had presented as a fortress was in many critical places a facade. He looked at his hands. They were steady. His hands were always steady. He had trained them to be. Under the table, they were pressed hard against his knees. Maxwell cross-examined Dr. Weiss for 20 minutes and did everything that could be done with the tools available to him. He challenged the methodology of the valuation. He questioned the chain of custody on 2 of the documents. He raised a jurisdictional argument about the offshore structures that was technically valid and which earned a prolonged exchange with Albright before being ultimately noted for the record without resolution. He was thorough and professional, and he did not concede anything he didn't have to concede. But when Dr. Weiss stepped down, the number was still in the record, $4.2 million above what Bradley had declared. Albright called a 15-minute recess without being asked. In the corridor, Bradley and Maxwell stood in the same alcove as before, and the conversation they had this time was shorter and stripped of any remaining pretense. Maxwell said, "She's going to find misrepresentation. I can't prevent that. The documentation is too clean." Bradley said, "What does that mean for the ruling?" "It means Albright has discretion to award assets beyond standard equitable distribution as a penalty. It means the offshore accounts are going back into the marital estate. It means we are likely looking at Sarah walking away with the majority of the combined marital assets." He paused. "And it means the equity question in Covington Data Dynamics is going to be adjudicated in the most unfavorable possible context in a courtroom where the judge has just found that you deliberately misrepresented your financial position." Bradley said nothing. Maxwell said, "I need you to consider whether settlement discussions at this point—" "No." "Bradley, no settlement." His voice was flat. "She wants a fight, she gets a fight." Maxwell looked at him for a long moment with the expression of a man who understands that the position being taken is irrational and who has no authority to override it. "All right," he said, "then we go back in." They went back in. What Bradley did not know, what he could not have known, because it had not yet entered the official record, was what Porter was preparing to present in the final hour of that afternoon session. He had processed the Vanguard revelation. He had processed the offshore accounts. He had recalibrated around each blow the way he always had, the way he had trained himself to do across 20 years of business. He was not recalibrated for what came next. Porter stood after the recess and said, "Your Honor, I'd like to call a witness." The witness was a man named Gerald Park. He was 61, slightly built, with the careful posture of someone who has spent decades in professional environments where precision matters. He was the founding managing partner of Park Lynn and Associates, a financial advisory firm based in Boston, and he testified without hesitation, the intermediary attorney for Vanguard Horizon Ventures at the time of its investment in Covington Data Dynamics. Maxwell said very quietly, "Who is this?" Bradley stared at the witness stand and felt his stomach drop 6 inches. Park testified calmly, answering Porter's questions with the thoroughness of someone who had reviewed his records carefully and had nothing to hide. He confirmed the nature of the investment. He confirmed the structure of the equity agreement. He confirmed that the buyout provision had been drafted, signed by Bradley Covington, and had never to his firm's knowledge been executed under the terms required by Illinois corporate law. And then Porter asked him a question that the room had not been expecting. "Mr. Park, in your dealings with the principal of Vanguard Horizon Ventures, the individual known to you as S.M. Chen, did you at any point form an understanding of her purpose in making this investment beyond the financial terms?" Maxwell objected on relevance. Albright considered it. Overruled. Park was quiet for a moment. He looked at his hands briefly, then back at Porter. "She was very specific about one thing," he said. "She said she wasn't making this investment for financial return. She said she was making it because the company had value, and the person running it had potential that was being undermined by a crisis he didn't fully understand. She said, and I remember this clearly because it was an unusual thing for an investor to say, she said she wanted to protect something that she believed in." The courtroom was very still. Porter said, "And did she ask for anything in return beyond the terms of the equity agreement?" "She asked for anonymity. She was extremely specific about that. She said under no circumstances was her identity to be disclosed to the company principal." "And did she give a reason?" Park paused again. "She said she wanted to know if the company could succeed on its own merits once the immediate crisis was resolved. She wanted to know if the person running it was genuinely capable or if he would find another cliff to walk off. She said—" He paused again, and when he continued, his voice had the quality of someone reciting something they have remembered exactly. "She said, I need to know who I married. The intake of breath from the gallery was audible. Bradley's hands, which had been flat on the table, curled slowly into fists. She had known, 8 years ago, when he was in the basement staring at spreadsheets, when he had been so deep inside his own crisis that he'd accepted an anonymous lifeline without looking too closely at where it came from. She had known exactly what she was doing, not just saving the company, watching him, measuring him, making a decision about who he was based on what he did when he thought no one was looking. The thought was so disorienting that for a moment he couldn't locate himself inside it. 20 years. She had watched him for 20 years, and she had concluded something about him clearly. The divorce had not caught her off guard. The filing had not scared her. She had prepared for it with 7 months of forensic accounting and a forensically verified paper trail that dated back nearly a decade, and she had done all of it with the patience of someone who had understood long before he had exactly where this marriage was going. She had seen him more clearly than he had ever seen her. He had looked at her and seen nothing. She had looked at him and seen everything. Maxwell was writing rapidly on his legal pad, building a cross-examination framework for Park, working every angle of the testimony, but Bradley wasn't watching him. He was watching Sarah, her back, the straight line of her spine, the way she was sitting with her hands folded on the table, completely still, the picture of composure. He thought about the morning he had slapped the divorce papers on the kitchen counter like he was closing a business deal. He thought about how he had stood in the bathroom rehearsing his calm, controlled, businesslike voice. He thought about how she had handed him his coffee before he had asked for it, same as every morning, and had said simply, "I know." She had known long before that morning. He understood that now, with a totality that felt less like realization and more like the conclusion of something that had been building for a long time, pressing against his understanding, and that had now simply broken through. Maxwell's cross-examination of Park was competent and produced nothing useful. Park was a 61-year-old managing partner of a Boston financial advisory firm who had reviewed his records thoroughly and had no stake in the outcome of this case. He answered every question with the same measured precision and stepped down from the witness stand as calmly as he had taken it. Albright looked at the clock. It was 4:17. She said, "We'll continue tomorrow morning at 9. I want counsel for both parties in my chambers at 8:30. She looked from Maxwell to Porter with an expression that communicated with complete clarity that what she had heard today had affected her view of this case, and that tomorrow's chambers meeting would not be a routine procedural conversation. Maxwell gathered his papers in silence. Bradley sat for a moment after everyone else began moving. The gallery was buzzing with conversation. The journalist was already through the door. One of Maxwell's associates put a hand briefly on Bradley's shoulder and then took it away. Bradley stood. He straightened his jacket. He picked up his briefcase. He looked one more time at Sarah. She was talking to Porter, her back still to him, and she reached up and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear with a gesture so ordinary, so completely herself, that it struck him in a place he hadn't expected, and he had to look away. In the corridor, he walked past Camilla without seeing her. She was standing near the far wall, having come to watch the afternoon session, and she said his name, Bradley, and he turned and looked at her, and in that moment something passed between them that was not words. It was the look of a man who had just returned from somewhere he had not expected to go and was not yet sure where he was. And it was the look of a woman who was beginning to do the calculation that every intelligent person eventually does when the outcome of a situation changes significantly. Camilla Rhodes was ambitious and perceptive, and she was very good at calculations. "How did it go?" she said, though her voice already held the careful quality of someone who has been watching and already knows. Bradley said, "It went." He kept walking. Behind him, he did not hear her follow. The November wind hit him when he pushed through the courthouse doors, sharp and immediate, and he stood on the top step for a moment, with his briefcase in his hand, and the noise of Chicago rising around him, the traffic, the distant sirens, the particular restless energy of the city. And he breathed it in one breath, the way you breathe before you go back under. Tomorrow at 8:30, Maxwell would be in chambers with Albright and Porter. Tomorrow the equity ruling would begin to take shape. Tomorrow the offshore accounts, the misrepresentation finding the Vanguard stake, all of it would converge into a judgment that Bradley could already feel the weight of even before it was delivered. He stood there another moment. Then he went down the steps because there was nothing else to do, and the city closed around him indifferent and vast, and the case that he had walked into 4 days ago, believing he had already won, moved without pause toward its conclusion. Bradley did not sleep. He lay in the apartment he had moved into 4 months ago, the one Camilla had called sleek and modern and perfect, and which now felt like a hotel room that had never belonged to him. And he stared at the ceiling from midnight until 5 in the morning, and then he got up and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with his phone in his hand and did not call anyone. There was no one to call. That was the thing he kept arriving at. Maxwell was his attorney, not his friend, and what he would say to Maxwell at 8:30 would be professional and measured and would not touch any of the things that were actually moving through Bradley's mind at 5 in the morning. His business partners didn't know the full picture. His brother lived in Phoenix, and they talked twice a year. His father had died 6 years ago. His mother was 74 and in a memory care facility in Evanston, and would not understand what he told her, even if he drove there now and sat beside her bed and said it all out loud. He thought about calling Marcus. He picked up the phone, set it down, picked it up again. His son's name on the screen, 17 years old, sleeping in the Oak Park house that was, according to Bradley's own settlement offer, Sarah's to keep. He set the phone down and did not call. He drank his coffee and thought about Gerald Park's testimony. He thought about the specific words, "I need to know who I married," and the way they had landed in the courtroom like a stone dropped from a height, the sound of it still reverberating somewhere in his chest at 5 in the morning. He had spent the night turning those words over and over, and what he kept arriving at, what he could not get away from, no matter how he approached it, was the devastating specificity of that question. She had needed to know, so she had run a test that lasted 8 years. And at the end of it, she had concluded something. She had seen something in the data, because that was how Sarah's mind worked. He understood that now she was always running data, always drawing conclusions from information that other people hadn't even noticed was information. And whatever she had concluded, it had brought her to a point where she was sitting in courtroom 14, waiting for a judge to hand her back everything she had built. What had she seen? What had the 8 years shown her? He knew the answer. He had known it since the moment Park finished testifying. He just had not been willing to look directly at it. She had seen exactly who he was. She had watched him take the anonymous lifeline, stabilize the company, grow it, and then over the years, slowly in the way that certain kinds of arrogance grow, take complete, unquestioned credit for every bit of it. She had watched him look at his own success and genuinely believe fully, and without doubt, that it was entirely self-made. She had watched him look at the woman beside him and see nothing but a supporting role in the story he was telling about himself. And then Camilla had come into the picture, and Sarah had watched that too, and she had made her decision, and she had spent 7 months building the case that was now piece by meticulous piece dismantling the story Bradley had told himself about his own life. He sat with that until 6:30. Then he showered, dressed, and drove to the courthouse. He arrived before Maxwell. He sat in the car in the parking garage for 11 minutes, and he did something he had not done since he was 26 years old, and broke and terrified in a way that had no bottom. He sat very still, and he let himself feel the full weight of what was happening without deflecting, without reframing, without the automatic defenses that 20 years of success had built into him. He felt it, the fear, the humiliation. The specific grief of understanding that the person you discarded without a second glance turned out to be the most significant person in your life, and you had been the last one to know it. He felt it for 11 minutes. Then he got out of the car because there was 8:30 in chambers, and there was a courtroom to sit in, and there was a judge to face, and none of that was going to stop because of what was happening in his chest. He was his father's son in that way, at least. You didn't stop. You kept moving. You dealt with what was in front of you. He just had never imagined that what would be in front of him at 42 after everything he had built would be this. Maxwell was waiting outside Judge Albright's chambers at 8:28. He looked like he had slept, which Bradley both respected and slightly resented. The two associates were not with him today. Maxwell had a single leather portfolio and the focused expression of a man who had spent the previous evening doing the only thing available to him, finding whatever ground he still had left to stand on. He looked at Bradley when Bradley arrived and said simply, "How are you?" Not a question, really, an assessment. "Ready," Bradley said. "Good." Maxwell straightened. Listen to me before we go in. Albright has called this chambers meeting for a reason. In my experience, when a judge calls both counsels in the morning after a day like yesterday, it is because she is considering her ruling and she wants to take the temperature of both parties on the question of settlement. She is going to indicate in one way or another what direction she is leaning. I need you to listen genuinely. Listen to what she communicates, and I need you to hold back every instinct you have to argue or push back. I hear you. Bradley. Maxwell looked at him directly. I need more than I hear you. I need you to actually do it. A beat. I'll do it. Porter arrived at 8:30 exactly. Sarah was not with her chambers. Meetings were counsel only, and Porter gave Maxwell a brief professional nod, and Bradley a look that was not unkind, but was entirely neutral, the look of a person who has no personal investment in this beyond her client's interest. She was carrying the same leather document case she always carried, and Bradley noticed, with the acute observation of someone who has lost the ability to feel safe and is compensating by watching everything, that it was not as thick today. She had presented most of her evidence. What she was carrying today was the conclusion. Albright's clerk opened the chamber's door at 8:32. They went in. Albright was standing at her desk rather than sitting, which Bradley registered as deliberate. She was a tall woman, and standing she carried a different authority. She had her reading glasses in her hand, but not on. She looked at both counsels without preamble. Sit down, she said, and they sat. I'm going to speak plainly, because I think we're past the point where anything else is useful. She looked at Maxwell. Counselor, I want to be direct with you. The financial disclosures submitted on behalf of your client have been materially contradicted by evidence that has been forensically verified. That is not a procedural issue. That is a factual finding, and it significantly affects my discretion in this case. She looked at Bradley with the measured directness of someone who has made a decision and is communicating it clearly. Mr. Covington, I am not going to editorialize, but I want you to understand that what has been established in my courtroom over the past 2 days is sufficient for me to make a ruling that you will find significantly unfavorable. That is your situation. Bradley said nothing. He had promised Maxwell, and he kept the promise. Albright continued. I am asking both parties through counsel whether there is any path to a settlement that avoids a full ruling, not because I am required to ask, because it is my practice to ask, and because in cases of this complexity, the parties often benefit from understanding what the alternative is before I deliver it. She looked at Porter. Ms. Porter, is your client open to a settlement discussion at this stage? Porter said, My client is prepared to discuss terms. However, she has authorized me to communicate that any settlement must include full acknowledgement of the Vanguard Horizon Equity Stake resolution of the offshore account discrepancy and a controlling position in Covington Data Dynamics. Those are not opening positions. They are minimums. Maxwell said, Your Honor, with respect, those terms essentially amount to a full ruling in the plaintiff's favor without the procedural. Yes, Albright said. They do. She let that sit for a moment. Mr. Maxwell, let me tell you what a full ruling in this case is likely to look like in my estimation based on the evidence before me. The offshore accounts are going back into the marital estate. The Vanguard Horizon equity claim, given the failure to execute the buyout provision, is valid under Illinois corporate law. When combined with standard equitable distribution of marital assets and the penalty discretion available to me under the misrepresentation findings, I believe the math is going to land somewhere in the vicinity of what Ms. Porter has just described, with the additional possibility of sanctions. She looked at Bradley again. Sanctions, Mr. Covington, are a public record. The word sanctions entered the room and stayed there. Bradley felt Maxwell's hand touch his forearm briefly under the table. A signal. He kept his face forward. Albright said, I'm going to give you until 10 o'clock to communicate with your respective clients. If we have a settlement framework by 10, I will consider it. If not, we proceed to full ruling. She stood. That's all. They were out of chambers by 8:51. In the corridor, Maxwell turned to Bradley immediately. Talk to me. Bradley had been walking, and he stopped. He put his hand on the wall briefly, then took it away. She's going to rule for Sarah. Yes, all of it. The equity, the offshore accounts, the marital assets, yes. With the misrepresentation finding in play, she has full discretion, and she's going to use it. Maxwell looked at him steadily. I have been doing this for 23 years. I know what I heard in that room. She has made up her mind. The only question remaining is whether you accept what Porter has offered, or whether you let Albright deliver it with sanctions attached. Sanctions, Bradley said. Public record. Every financial institution, every business partner, every future investor who runs a background check on Bradley Covington will find a civil sanctions finding for material misrepresentation in a financial disclosure. That is a business consequence that extends well beyond this case. A long silence stretched between them in the corridor outside Judge Albright's chambers. Bradley said, "What does she actually get in Porter's terms? Walk me through it exactly." Maxwell did. Controlling equity in Covington Data Dynamics. The Vanguard stake properly adjudicated, combined with equitable distribution of marital interest in the company's growth during the marriage, would bring Sarah's position to 79%. Bradley would retain 21% as a minority shareholder in the company he had built. He would have no operational control. The offshore accounts returned to the marital estate would be divided equitably. The Oak Park house would remain with Sarah. Alimony terms would be renegotiated from the beginning based on the actual asset picture rather than the one Bradley had presented. He would not be broke. That was not what was happening. He would have his 21%, which at the current valuation was worth something approaching $4.5 million. He would have a portion of the marital estate, the apartment, his personal accounts. He would be, by any objective measure, a wealthy man. But he would be a minority shareholder in his own company, in the company he had started in a basement, the company he had built, the company that was the story he told about himself when he lay awake at night and ran through the evidence of his own worth. That was what it cost. That specific thing, that story, that was what it cost. Maxwell said, "Bradley, I need an answer. He was quiet for a moment longer. Then something shifted in him, not dramatically, not with any outward sign, just a subtle internal settling, the kind that comes when you stop fighting the thing you've already lost and start figuring out how to carry what remains. "Tell Porter we'll discuss terms," he said. Maxwell exhaled. Not obviously, not unprofessionally, but Bradley heard it. But the settlement discussion happened in a conference room on the second floor without Albright, with only the two attorneys and their clients, and a court-appointed mediator named James Okonkwo, who had the practiced neutrality of a man who had sat in this kind of room many times and understood that his job was to keep things moving without taking sides. Bradley and Sarah sat across from each other for the first time in this entire proceeding at the same table. He had not been this close to her since the morning in the kitchen. She was wearing a different dress today, dark green, still simple, still without anything ostentatious about it. Her reading glasses were on the table beside her notepad. She looked as she had looked every day in this courtroom, completely composed. He looked at her across the table and said, before Maxwell could stop him, before the mediator could set the procedural framework, before any of the careful professional choreography could begin, he said, "Why didn't you tell me about Vanguard 8 years ago? Why didn't you ever tell me?" Sarah looked at him. The question hung in the air of the conference room, and Okonkwo said, "We should probably begin with," and Porter said, "My client isn't required to," and Sarah raised one hand slightly, barely 2 inches off the table, and both of them stopped. She looked at Bradley, and she said, "Because I wanted to see what you would do. With the company. With everything." Her voice was even unhurried, the voice of someone who has thought about this answer for a long time and knows exactly what it is. "I wanted to see who you would become when you thought you had done it alone. I wanted to see if that man would be someone I could build a life with." A pause. "I had my answer within 3 years, but I had 2 boys who needed stability, and I thought—" She stopped for a moment, not because she was upset, because she was precise, and she was choosing the right words. "I thought people could change. I waited, and you didn't change. You just kept becoming more of what you already were." The room was very still. Bradley said, "And Camilla." "Camilla was the conclusion," Sarah said, "not the cause." He absorbed that. He looked down at the table for a moment, then back up. "The 8 years, building all of it while I didn't see any of it." He hesitated. "Did it make you angry?" Something moved across Sarah's face that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. "It kept me focused," she said. Okonkwo cleared his throat gently. "Perhaps we should." "Yes," Sarah said, and she picked up her reading glasses and put them on, and she looked at the settlement documents in front of her, and the conversation that had just happened in the conference room folded itself away into the professional proceeding that resumed around it, and they began. The terms were finalized at 12:44. 79% equity stake confirmed. Offshore accounts returned to the marital estate divided equitably with the larger portion to Sarah in recognition of the Vanguard principal investment. The Oak Park house Sarah's. Alimony recalculated. A mutual non-disparagement clause, which Maxwell had insisted on, and Porter had accepted without visible reaction. Bradley signed each document with his full name, pressing the pen firmly, not rushing. He was aware of everything in the room, the sound of papers moving, the slight squeak of Okonkwo's chair, the scratch of Porter's pen countersigning in the way that you are aware of every detail when you understand that something is ending. When the last document was signed, Sarah took off her reading glasses and placed them on the table. She looked at the papers in front of her for a moment. Then she looked up. Not at Maxwell, not at the mediator, at Bradley. She looked at him for a moment with an expression that was entirely unreadable, and then she said quietly, "Take care of the boys." He said, "I will." She nodded once. And that was it. That was 20 years settling into 3 words and a nod in a second-floor conference room in Cook County Circuit Court on a November Friday in Chicago. Porter was already organizing the documents. Maxwell was on his phone. Okonkwo was gathering his materials. Bradley sat for another moment after everyone else began moving. He thought about the basement where he had started the company. The late nights, the early mornings, the belief so fierce and hot, it had felt like fuel. He had not been wrong about all of it. He had built something real. He had genuinely worked, and the company was genuinely his in the ways that mattered: his vision, his risk, his relentless energy. But he had not done it alone. He had never done it alone. And the woman who had made sure he could do it at all had been right there the whole time in the gray cardigan with the unrepaired cuff. He stood. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. He looked at the doorway through which Sarah had just walked, and he understood with a clarity that had no comfort in it, but was true in the way that only certain things are true, clean and permanent and beyond argument. He had underestimated her. Every single day of 20 years he had looked at her and seen what he expected to see, and he had never once looked closer. And that failure of vision, not her patience, not her planning, not her $85 million, but simply his own refusal to see her, that was the thing that had brought him here. The paperwork was done. The judgment was finalized. And outside, the Chicago wind was still blowing, and the city was still moving. And Sarah Covington was walking toward the elevator with her attorney, her reading glasses in her hand, her footsteps steady on the courthouse floor, headed somewhere that Bradley Covington, for the first time in 20 years, was not part of. The elevator doors closed behind Sarah and Porter, and the number above the panel counted down, and the courthouse went on around them the way courthouses always do, indifferent, procedural, full of other people's consequences. Porter spoke first. She said, "You know, I've handled 100 cases like this." "I know," Sarah said. "I've never had one like this." Porter looked at her sideways. 79%. Final, clean. No sanctions on your side, no appeal pathway he can reasonably pursue. That's... She paused, searching for the right word. "That's complete." Sarah looked at the elevator doors. "Yes," she said. "It is." The doors opened on the ground floor, and they walked out into the lobby, and Sarah put her reading glasses into her bag, and she breathed in the particular institutional air of the building, recycled slightly too warm, and she felt something move through her that she had been holding back for days. Not triumph, not relief exactly, something quieter than both of those. Something that felt more like the moment after a very long journey when you finally stop moving and realize that you are, at last, where you were trying to get to. She had been traveling toward this for a long time, longer than 7 months of forensic preparation, longer than the 8 years since Vanguard, longer perhaps than she had admitted to herself until this moment. Porter held the lobby door open for her and Sarah walked through it, and the Chicago wind hit her face and she closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. Then she opened them and kept walking. Her phone buzzed. Marcus. The text said, "Mom, tell me." She typed back, "Come home. I'll explain everything." 3 seconds. Then, "We won." She looked at those 2 words on the screen for a moment. Then she typed, "We were never losing." She put her phone in her bag and kept walking toward the parking structure, and behind her the Cook County Circuit Court building receded, and the city moved around her, and Sarah Covington, S.M., Chen MIT, trained $85 million woman, 79% owner of a $22 million tech company, mother of 2 boys, former housewife. The most underestimated person in every room she had ever walked into went home. What happened in the days immediately following the settlement moved faster than Bradley had anticipated, which was itself a kind of final lesson in how thoroughly he had miscalculated the situation. The story broke on Saturday morning. The journalist who had been in the gallery on Thursday had filed his piece late Friday night, and by Saturday at 9, the article was running on 3 Chicago media outlets and had been picked up by 2 national financial publications. The headline on the financial piece read, "Anonymous investor behind tech company's survival revealed as CEO's wife court awards her 79% equity." It was clean factual, and it had the particular quality of a story that people wanted to share because it contained the specific combination of elements a secret kept for years. A betrayal answered with patience rather than rage. A quiet person revealed to be extraordinary that made people feel something when they read it. By Saturday afternoon, it had reached social media with the velocity of something that the internet had already decided it cared about. Bradley read the article in his apartment at 9:47 Saturday morning and sat very still for a long time afterward. He had anticipated that some coverage might happen. Maxwell had mentioned the possibility. What he had not anticipated was the specific framing: not Bradley Covington loses divorce, but Sarah Covington saves company the credit for which her husband claimed entirely and then tries to leave her with nothing. That framing, which was factually accurate, landed in a media environment that received it with what Bradley could only describe as enthusiasm. His phone started ringing at 10:15. Business contacts first, then a board member of a company he sat on, then 2 investors he had been cultivating for an expansion round that was supposed to launch in January. The calls had a consistent quality professional, carefully worded, expressing concern, noting that the coverage had raised some questions that needed to be addressed before they could move forward. By noon, the January expansion round was for all practical purposes dead. Maxwell called at 12:30 and said, "I told you about the sanctions. The coverage is functioning as the equivalent. I'm sorry, Bradley. This is the consequence of how the case developed." Bradley said, "I know. What do you want to do about the board seat?" "I'll handle it." "There's also going to be a question from the Covington Data Dynamics Board about the equity transfer and your new minority position, and what that means for—" "I'll handle it," Bradley said again. Maxwell was quiet for a moment. "Bradley, how are you actually doing?" The question surprised him. In 23 years of professional interaction, Maxwell had never asked him that. He had asked how the case was going, how the numbers looked, how the strategy was holding, but not that, not the actual question. Bradley said, "I'm working on it." "That's honest," Maxwell said. "Take care of yourself." The call ended and Bradley put the phone face down on the table and looked at the ceiling of the apartment that Camilla had called sleek and modern and perfect, and he thought about the fact that Camilla had not called since Thursday in the corridor when he had walked past her and kept walking, and she had not followed. He had checked once out of something that was not quite hope, but was in the neighborhood of wanting to be wrong. No message, no call, nothing. He had not been surprised. He had not even been hurt, which told him something about what that had actually been and what it had not been. He ordered food he didn't eat, and he sat in the apartment until evening, and then he called Marcus. His son answered on the second ring, which meant he had been waiting for the call. "Dad." "Hey." Bradley's voice came out slightly rougher than he intended. He cleared it. "I wanted to call, to talk. If you're—" "I'm here," Marcus said. "Eli's here too. We're both here." The knowledge that both of his sons were there in the Oak Park house, probably on the couch in the den where they had always done their homework. hit Bradley somewhere in the center of his chest with a force that surprised him. He put his hand over his mouth for a moment. He got himself back. "I want you to know something," he said. "Both of you. What happened in that courtroom? I want you to understand that your mother—" He stopped, reorganized. "Your mother is the most capable person I have ever known. I should have said that a long time ago. I should have known it a long time ago. I didn't." He paused. "That's on me." A silence on the other end. Then Eli's voice slightly nasal the way it got when he was trying not to cry. "Dad, we know." "I know you know. I just needed to say it." Marcus said, "Are you okay?" "I'm getting there." "Okay." A beat. "You should come to dinner sometime. Mom said you could come to dinner." That stopped him. She said the boys need their father, and the house is big enough that we can all sit at a table without it being a thing. Her words. A pause, and in the pause Bradley could hear Marcus trying to be 17 and adult about something that he was also just a teenager about, and the combination of those two things was so purely his son that Bradley had to close his eyes for a second. "She means it. She's not Mom doesn't say things she doesn't mean." "No," Bradley said. "She never has." He came to dinner the following Thursday. He stood at the door of the Oak Park house, the house that was now legally and completely Sarah's, and he rang the bell, which he had never done in 20 years of living there because it had been his house too. And you don't ring the bell at your own house, but it was not his house anymore, and ringing the bell was the honest thing to do, and Sarah had raised him to do the honest thing. She had raised his sons to do the honest thing. He had just been the last one in the family to catch up. Sarah opened the door. She was wearing the gray cardigan, the one with the small hole near the left cuff that she had never bothered to mend. He noticed it immediately. He didn't know if she had put it on deliberately or if it was simply what she had reached for when she got home that evening. But he saw it, and something moved through him that was half grief and half something he couldn't name. She stepped back from the door. "Come in." He came in. Dinner was not simple, but it was real. Eli talked too much in the way he did when he was nervous, filling every silence with commentary about school and his robotics team and a YouTube video he had watched that he needed everyone to know about. Marcus was quieter, eating steadily, watching his parents with the careful attention he had inherited directly from his mother. Sarah moved between the kitchen and the table with the easy competence of someone in complete command of her space, and she talked about ordinary things: a neighbor's dog, a book she was reading, a small issue with the furnace that she had already had someone come to look at, and she addressed Bradley with the natural ease of someone who had made a private decision and was simply living it. There was no performance of forgiveness. There was no managed cordiality that cost her something to maintain. She was simply herself at her table with her sons and their father, and she had decided this was how it would be, and so it was. After dinner, when Eli had gone upstairs and Marcus was loading the dishwasher and making pointed noise about giving the adults space to talk, Sarah poured 2 cups of coffee without asking, same as always, same as 20 years, same as the morning with the divorce papers, and she sat across from Bradley at the kitchen table. He said, "Thank you, for dinner, for this." She wrapped both hands around her mug. "The boys need this. That's what it's for." "I know, still." He looked at the table for a moment. "I've been thinking about what you said in the conference room. About waiting. About watching." He looked up. "I don't expect an apology for any of it. I want to be clear about that. What you did, the way you handled all of it, it was right. You were right." Sarah looked at him steadily. "I know." He almost smiled. "Almost. I just needed to say it out loud, so it was said." She nodded. She drank her coffee. The kitchen was quiet around them in the specific way that kitchens are quiet after meals. Warm, slightly disheveled, the smell of food still in the air. Outside Chicago in late November was cold and dark, and the wind was moving. And in here there was coffee, and the sound of Marcus finishing up at the sink, and the particular complicated piece of a family that had broken and was figuring out carefully and honestly what shape came next. Sarah said, "I want to tell you something. Not for you to apologize for, just so you know it." "Okay." "The night you filed before you told me, I mean. The night I saw it coming when I knew." She paused. "I thought about not fighting. I thought about taking what you offered. taking the house and the alimony, and just letting it be over. She looked at her mug. Not because I didn't know my own worth. I've always known my own worth. But because fighting meant everything coming out. The Vanguard documents, the MIT years, all of it. It meant becoming visible. In a way that I had spent a long time choosing not to be. Bradley was very still. What changed your mind? She looked at him. Marcus asked me if I was actually okay. And I looked at him and I thought, what am I teaching him? What does he learn if I take the quiet exit? What does Eli learn? She set her mug down. I didn't fight for the money. I have more money than I will ever need. I fought because my sons were watching, and I wanted them to see that you don't accept less than what's true. Just because someone is confident, you will. The silence that followed was long and full, and neither of them broke it for a moment. Then Bradley said quietly, "You did the right thing." "I always do," she said, and there was something in it that was not arrogance and not even humor exactly, just the particular certainty of a person who has thought carefully about who they are and is at peace with the answer. Upstairs, Eli called down, "Mom, can I have the last of the leftover pasta?" "Yes," Sarah called back. And just like that, the kitchen was ordinary again, and she stood and began clearing the table, and Bradley stood and helped her, and they moved around each other with the muscle memory of 20 years passing, dishes finding counter space, not speaking, not needing to. What happened in the following months was this. The story continued to circulate in financial circles, in legal circles, in the specific online spaces where people were drawn to stories about intelligence and patience and the long game. A profile piece ran in a business publication with Sarah's permission, and on her terms, which was the first time SM Chen and Sarah Covington had appeared in the same article publicly. She was photographed at her desk, a desk in the Oak Park house, in a room that Bradley had never known she used, lined with books and screens, and the kind of organized complexity that told the story of a mind that was always working. She was wearing a blazer in the photo. Under it, just barely visible at the wrist, was the edge of a gray cardigan. The piece ran under the headline, "The Investor Who Saved a Company from the Inside and Why She Waited 20 Years to Say So." It was read in the first week by 400,000 people. Covington Data Dynamics, under the new equity structure, brought in a CEO to handle day-to-day operations. Sarah retained her position as the majority stakeholder and took a seat on the board, her first public professional role, which she stepped into with the complete ease of someone who has been doing the work for years and is simply at last putting her name on it. At the first board meeting she attended, the new CEO, a woman named Patricia Huang, who had been recruited from a firm in Seattle and who had read the profile piece and reached out within 48 hours of its publication, looked around the table and said, "I want to hear from our majority stakeholder, Ms. Covington." And Sarah had put on her reading glasses and opened the folder in front of her, and she had spoken for 12 minutes about the company's strategic direction, about the market position, about the capital allocation decisions she believed needed to be made in the next 18 months. She spoke with precision and depth and complete authority, and when she finished, Patricia Huang looked at her and said simply, "Good, let's build." Bradley attended a board meeting 6 weeks after the transition. As a minority shareholder, he had the right to observe. He sat at the far end of the table, which he had once sat at the head of, and he watched his company. His company, the company he had started in a basement. The company he had poured 20 years into being run well. Being run honestly better than it had been run in years, with a clarity of strategic thinking and a depth of financial understanding that he recognized, watching it as Sarah's fingerprints even in the places where it had predated her formal involvement. She had always understood this company better than he had. She had understood it because she had saved it, and saving something teaches you its structure in a way that nothing else does. After the meeting in the corridor, Bradley walked alongside Sarah toward the elevator, and she let him, and they walked for a moment in silence before he said, "You're good at this." She glanced at him. "I know." "I mean the board, Huang, the whole thing." He paused. "I built something worth building. I can still see that it's worth something." Sarah looked at him, and this time, what crossed her face was fully a smile, small and genuine, and without any edge in it at all. "Yes," she said, "you did. That part was always real, Bradley." She pressed the elevator button. It just wasn't only yours. The elevator came. They rode down in silence that was not uncomfortable. Just present the silence of two people who have said the things that needed to be said and have arrived somewhere that is not what either of them planned, but is in its own complicated way honest. The doors opened. Sarah stepped out. She had a meeting in 40 minutes with a portfolio manager from a fund in New York who had been trying to get 30 minutes of her time for 2 months, and she had her reading glasses in her bag and her notepad and the specific forward-leaning energy of a person moving toward things rather than away from them. And she said goodbye to Bradley with a nod that was brief and real and carried in it everything that long acquaintance carries: history, clarity, the weight of what was known. And then she walked through the lobby and out the door and into Chicago, and the city received her the way it always does, its sharpest people, without ceremony, without fanfare, just the next step, and the one after that. Marcus was waiting outside on the sidewalk. He had driven down to meet her, 17 years old, with a provisional license and the cautious pride of someone who has recently discovered that independence is real. He was leaning against the car with his hands in his jacket pockets, and when he saw his mother come through the door, he straightened and took his hands out of his pockets. She walked up to him and touched his face briefly with one hand, the quick, certain gesture of a mother who knows her son, and he rolled his eyes slightly in the way of 17 but did not pull away. "How'd it go?" he said. "Good," she said. "Get in, I'll drive." "You always say you'll drive." "Because I'm always right about that." She got in the car. Marcus laughed, actually laughed, the full laugh that he reserved for the moments when his mother said something that was simultaneously completely simple and completely true. He got in beside her. She drove. And behind them in the building, they had just left in the corridor outside the boardroom, where Covington Data Dynamics was being rebuilt into something better and more honest than it had ever been under the name alone. The name on the door still said Covington, but the story had changed, and stories, once they change, do not go back. Bradley Covington stood at the elevator for a moment after it closed, and then he walked back to his office, the corner office he still used as a minority shareholder. Smaller now in what it meant, even though the room itself hadn't changed, and he sat down and put his hands flat on the desk, and he thought about everything and nothing the way you think in the aftermath of a storm, when the air is different and the damage is visible and the work of rebuilding has not yet fully begun. He had lost the majority of something he had built, but he had also in the wreckage found the closest thing to honesty he had experienced in 20 years. And honesty, it turned out, even when it cost you everything you thought you had, was the only foundation on which anything real could actually stand. Down on the street, Sarah Covington pulled into traffic with the easy confidence of a woman who knows exactly where she is going, and the city moved around her, and the November sky was high and gray and wide, and she was quietly, completely without apology and without performance, exactly who she had always been. She had never been hiding. The world had simply never bothered to look. That was its mistake. And now it knew better. Sonnet 4.6, Low.